Hi, this is Dr. James Benjamin, and I'm going to do a brief presentation on replication and reproduction. Okay, um, there are two different types of replication that we can talk about, direct replication and conceptual replication. Let's start with direct replication. The idea is, as the name would be implies, is you're doing an exact replication of a previous study. So what you're doing is you're using identical measures and identical research procedures, sometimes called protocols, to the original study or to the original experiment, or at least as identical as is humanly possible. Okay, so the idea is you've got the exact same variables, you've measured the exact same way, using the exact same procedures. Okay, to give you an idea of how this would work, uh, there was a classic weapons effect experiment from the late 1960s by Berkowitz and LePage, which seemed to find that when individuals were highly provoked, they were more prone to give electric shocks um, when exposed to weapons than when exposed to badminton rackets, just to give you some idea of how that would work. So in essence, you have two independent variables, which are going to be provocation level and exposure to either weapons or neutral objects. So those are the two IVs. Um, and then the dependent variable is the number of electric shocks that participants give their opponent, which can be at minimum 1 and maximum 7. All right, so Arnold Buss and his research team in the early 1970s at University of Texas um, conducted an experiment that was a direct replication of Berkowitz and LePage's original experiment. They had the exact same independent variables, manipulated exactly the same way. Um, they used the exact same dependent variable, the number of electric shocks, as Berkowitz and LePage used, and they used the same number of participants per treatment condition. You name it, they did it. Um, and although this was a failed replication attempt, meaning that Buss and colleagues were not able to find the significant effect that Berkowitz and LePage did, their efforts actually led, for at least a bit, to some questioning about the validity of the original finding and whether it could really replicate in the first place. Okay, so that's actually a fairly useful um, example of direct replication and how it can lead us to be a little more skeptical about initial promising findings. Now let's try another one, conceptual replication. Okay, sometimes this is referred to as indirect or incomplete replication. And so here, instead of using the exact same measures and protocols as the original research report, the researchers who are doing the replication will use different measures and maybe some different protocols. Okay, so for example, with a weapons effect study, instead of having the provocation independent variable be with between subjects, we could make it a within subjects variable. That would be just one example of how we could manage to make that happen. And maybe we could use noise blasts to provoke individuals instead of verbal insults. All right, maybe we could use noise blasts as our dependent variable instead of electric shocks. So, I mean, there's some things here that we can do as far as conceptual replication goes that would allow us to still see if indeed the effect is there. All right. So um, the idea, though, is that whatever we're doing differently, we still have reason to believe, based on theory, that we are measuring the constructs that are of interest to us. In this case, provocation, exposure to weapons or neutral objects, and the outcome measure of aggression. So just to give you an idea of how a conceptual replication could work, let's go back to Layens and Park. In the mid-1970s, they published a successful conceptual replication of Berkowitz and LePage's weapons effect experiment. Um, in their case, they used images of firearms and neutral objects instead of actual weapons and badminton rackets. So the weapons and neutral objects are still there, it's just that instead of being physical objects that are in the lab with you, they are now pictures that are showing up on a screen. All right, so, and I think they used maybe a different measure of aggression in the process. But the main thing is that they were able to effectively replicate what Berkowitz and LePage found. Ariel and colleagues did something that they called the less than lethal weapons effect. And in the less than lethal weapons effect paper that they published, what they did was they randomly assigned police officers in the city of London to wear their tasers visibly or to keep them concealed. Okay, so the weapons independent variable is really whether, the presence or absence of tasers, and the dependent variable was attempts to attack the officer. Um, and attempts to attack the officer did go up statistically significantly in the taser's present condition than in the taser's hidden condition, thus conceptually replicating the original Berkowitz and LePage finding. So what do these types of replication buy for us? Well, direct replication, when successful, gives us in the scientific community more confidence in the operational definitions that we're using, so the measurements we're using, the manipulations we're using in an experiment, as well as more confidence in the use of the specific research design that we're employing. So in that sense, direct replication is a really great thing to have. Okay, conceptual replication, when successful, does something else for us. It gives us more confidence in the theory that we are testing. Okay, so that's what we're using conceptual replication for. It's more theory testing than anything else. Um, and again, various conceptual replications, for example, of a paper I was involved in, Anderson, Benjamin, and Bartholow, back in the late 1990s, gives us some tentative confidence that the general aggression model and other cognitively oriented theoretical models in aggression used to explain the weapons effect are basically reflecting reality, at least insofar as we could say through these various experiments, each doing something a little bit different, that aggressive cognitions are being primed by the mere exposure to weapons when compared to neutral objects. Okay, so so from a theory standpoint, that's been, I think, relatively good news. Now, there are limitations to replications, quite obviously. You can replicate something that really isn't particularly of value to us in the sciences or for everyday human life. That's one possibility. Another thing is that you can have a situation, as in the case of the weapons priming research, that started with Anderson and colleagues back in the 90s, a situation where basically the same team of researchers, the same cohort of researchers, are all doing the conceptual replications, thus making it unclear whether or not the effect actually would replicate independently of that particular group. Okay, so you do have to be, kind of careful there. Okay, so that's replication in a nutshell. About reproduction. Okay, when we talk about reproduction, what we're talking about is a data analysis question. What happens if I get the original data set from a team of researchers? Can I take the statistical methods that they claimed to use and get the exact same findings right down to the exact means, standard deviations, the exact test statistics, the exact p-values, and so on? Okay, can we precisely find that? Okay, when we reproduce successfully another researcher's findings, we're doing so ideally with access to that original data set, and then we proceed to analyze it based on what those researchers did, as I noted before. So when we say that we can successfully reproduce the findings, we're saying that essentially we were able to obtain the same descriptive and inferential statistics that the original researchers did with their data. If we're not able to reproduce the original findings, that is a potential red flag for some sort of a reporting error, or worse yet, possibly some fraud. Although be careful and be circumspect and don't accuse somebody of fraud right out of the starting gate. So there's that. Reanalysis. This is something else we can do with somebody else's data. Let's say that we take a look at an article or a paper. We see how the authors analyze the data, but we're questioning whether or not the analysis plan used by the original researchers was appropriate, or we think we might have a better analysis plan. And we want to see if we still can, what we find that's the same, what we can find that's different from the original researchers. Okay. And so that is, so again, we're just reanalyzing the data using different techniques from the original researchers. So an original researcher might have used Bayesian analysis to test her particular hypothesis. And I might be more interested in using sort of the standard frequentist approach that I was trained in, null hypothesis testing, essentially. And so what I might say is, why don't we've got two treatment conditions here, and we've got a dependent variable, why don't we just run a standard t-test and see if we get a p of less than 0.05. What am I doing? I'm simply doing a reanalysis. That's it. And I might find out that I obtained similar results to the original researchers and draw the same conclusions they did using a different technique. Or I might discover something that the original researchers missed, which in and of itself might be of interest. Okay. Let's do a case study here, specifically looking at reproduction and reanalysis. And in a way, we'll kind of see that the word replication will kind of jump into the mix here a little bit. So let's start with a nice little provocative question. Can playing a first-person shooter game where you as the player use a gun-shaped controller, can that make you a better marksman? If we were to put you into a firing range, hand you a, say, a low caliber rifle or shotgun, and have you shoot at a target sheet. Okay, how well is how good is your accuracy? Can you make headshots the way you did in the video game, for example? That's what Whitaker and Bushman claimed in 2014. Okay, compared to all of the other treatment conditions, including the first-person shooter conditions, shooting accuracy was far higher, Whitaker and Bushman reported, when the controller was gun-shaped than in any other context, in any other condition. It's a pretty audacious finding and a pretty audacious claim. So let's find out if it's actually real. How do we do that? Well, Patrick Markey, who basically found that his eyes were quite opened by the whole thing, was very eager to see the original findings and try to reproduce them. Because, quite frankly, this is something that would cause all of us to have to rethink a few things about what video games can and can't do. Okay. Um, Later on, Malta Elson became involved in this reanalysis project. Each of them independently attempted to reproduce the main finding of Whitaker and Bushman with the data set that Bushman eventually provided to them via email. And I'll just give you a little spoiler alert now. It did not go well. Patrick Markey was unable to reproduce the finding that Whitaker and Bushman had published, and Elson had the same problem as Malta Elson had the same problem as Patrick Markey. Okay, so they do due diligence at that point. They contact the author. The authors ask, "Hey, what's up?" Authors in this case stonewalled a bit. But eventually, the Ohio State University got um, data scrubbed from a hard drive to them to examine. And what Markey and Elson found was kind of disturbing. It looked like there was what was called code switching. So somewhere among the different data sets, including the one that would be the basis for the publication, um, for the independent variable, okay, the type of um, gaming condition and controller the players had, um, there had been that the way that independent variable was coded differed for specific participants depending upon which iteration of the data set we were looking at. So this actually starts to look like code switching. And eventually Markey and Elson found the data set that would have presumably um, uh, given the results that Whitaker and Bushman reported. What that did, though, was it did lead to a lot of questioning about which of those data sets was actually real, which one could we actually believe, and without a satisfactory answer, eventually the journal in question retracted by 2017 the Whitaker and Bushman article. This ended up being a double tragedy for Jodie Whittaker because she would eventually lose her PhD based on a separate concern about the validity of the data in her PhD dissertation. Okay, so that's another story altogether. So pretty damning stuff, to say the least. Okay, but that's what reproduction can do. It can allow us to say, "Oh wow, I can't find the results that the original authors seem to find." Okay, so let's look at reanalysis. After the article was retracted, Bushman published what he billed as a replication in a journal called Aggressive Behavior. And so this is supposed to be a replication of the original Whitaker and Bushman experiment. Um, and when you read through that particular article, Bushman definitely pushes it as a replication. Again, Markey and Elson managed to get a hold of the data set, this time because it was actually made publicly available, thankfully. And they could tell really quickly that the way that Bushman was concluding um, a replication was by combining different uh, violent uh, video game treatment conditions, okay, and comparing them to more neutral conditions, if my memory serves me correctly here. But if you actually use the original data analysis plan that Whitaker and Bushman reported in their retracted paper, what you find is that there is nothing particularly interesting when participants use a gun-shaped controller while playing the video game. They are not able to successfully fire at a target with a real firearm in a firing range relative to participants in the other conditions. So this is actually a replication failure that is discovered by a reanalysis of the data. Patrick Markey published and Malta Elson published their reanalysis in a blog called the 100CI, a blog that I certainly recommend strongly. So, what they were able to do is say, hey, look, we reanalyzed the data. We noticed that the apparent replication is not a replication at all. Here's what's really happening. All right. So hopefully, now that we are finished with this final slide here, we have seen that there is a distinction between replication and reproduction, and also reproduction and reanalysis, each of which has its own important place in making sure that our science is trustworthy.